In the darkness just before dawn, when the world feels suspended between sleep and awakening, a woman lay bleeding on a cold floor, her pulse fading, her breath shallow, and every sign around her screaming that she was already dead because the police would later mark this as a completed murder. The coroner would almost sign the certificate, and the person who tried to erase her existence walked away believing the job was finished. Yet this is a true crime story where death made a mistake, because she survived her own murder. And what followed shattered every assumption investigators had about truth, memory, and justice. This case begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood that looked harmless from the outside, a place of trimmed hedges, softly glowing porch lights, and streets so calm they seemed immune to violence, where the victim, a woman in her early 30s known to friends as disciplined, private, and relentlessly hardworking, had built a life that appeared stable, if not entirely happy. Because behind the carefully organized routines and polite smiles was a mounting sense of fear that something was very wrong. Fear centered around a man who once promised protection and love but gradually became a source of control, tension, and quiet threats. A man who would soon become both the primary suspect and the reason this case almost disappeared forever. The environment mattered because this was a town where violent crime was rare, where neighbors trusted each other, where police reports usually involved noise complaints or missing pets, not blood-soaked living rooms. And that sense of safety would later contribute to critical mistakes in the investigation, mistakes that nearly allowed a calculated crime to remain buried. On the night of the attack, there were no witnesses, no screams reported, no frantic calls for help, just a sequence of events reconstructed later through fragments, blood patterns, and one voice that should not have existed because she was not supposed to wake up, let alone remember. According to what could be pieced together, the crime unfolded with chilling precision, beginning with a familiar presence entering the home without force, without fear, and without resistance. Because trust was the weapon, and once inside, the argument escalated quickly, words turning sharp, movements turning aggressive, until the violence exploded in a matter of seconds. A blunt force blow, followed by another, and then the final act meant to silence her permanently, leaving her body motionless, blood pooling, vital signs barely detectable, and the attacker convinced there was no possibility of survival. He left calmly, locking the door behind him, discarding evidence methodically, and later telling a story that placed him far away, believing he had committed the perfect crime. Hours later, when daylight crept into the house, something went wrong with that perfect plan because, against all biological probability, she gasped, a reflex driven by instinct rather than consciousness. And in that moment, the line between life and death blurred, creating one of the rarest situations in true crime, a victim who outlived her own homicide. When emergency responders arrived alerted by a delayed welfare check, they found a scene so clearly fatal that even seasoned professionals hesitated. Blood loss was extreme, skull fractures severe, and body temperature dangerously low, yet there was movement faint but undeniable, forcing them to rush her to the hospital under circumstances normally reserved for miracles. Doctors later admitted that survival odds were almost non-existent, that every textbook suggested she should not have made it through transport surgery or the following coma, but she did, unconscious, fragile, and unknowingly holding the key to unraveling a crime that police already believed they understood. The investigation began in confusion, because officers initially treated the scene as a straightforward domestic homicide, identifying the partner immediately, securing what evidence they thought sufficient, and preparing a case that relied heavily on circumstantial timelines and assumptions rather than deep forensic analysis. While she lay in a hospital bed, her brain swollen, her memory fragmented, and her condition listed as critical but stable. This is where the case took its first dark turn, because investigators publicly stated there was nothing to suggest survival. Paperwork moved forward under that assumption, and subtle procedural steps reflected a conclusion reached too early, a dangerous habit in many dark case files throughout history. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, against expectations, she opened her eyes, unable to speak at first, unable to move properly, but aware enough to understand she was alive, and alive meant the truth could no longer stay buried. Her recovery was slow and painful, filled with nightmares, involuntary flashes, and moments of terror triggered by simple sounds. Yet as doctors reduced sedation and therapists encouraged communication, fragments of memory began surfacing, not as clear narratives, but as images, sensations, and notions that pointed unmistakably toward one person. When detectives returned, expecting little more than confusion, they were met with something no murderer anticipates: identification, detail, and an insistence that the story they believed was wrong. This forced a reopening of the case, transforming a closed homicide into a living investigation, exposing mistakes, overlooked evidence, and inconsistencies that now demanded accountability. Blood spatter that once seemed irrelevant was reanalyzed, phone records re-examined, and alibi statements rechecked, revealing cracks that had been ignored because everyone assumed there would never be testimony. The suspect's version of events began to collapse under scrutiny, his calm demeanor giving way to irritation, then anger, as investigators pressed harder, armed now with a survivor rather than a corpse. The psychological impact of confronting a victim who should not exist cannot be overstated, because it disrupts the narrative control offenders rely on. And in this case, it led to errors, contradictions, and ultimately a confession that was partial, strategic, and telling in what it avoided saying. Court proceedings turned public interest toward the case, media outlets labeling it a miracle survival story while true crime audiences dissected every detail, every procedural failure, and every chilling moment when death nearly won. Prosecutors faced challenges because defense attorneys argued memory contamination, trauma-induced distortion, and medical improbability, attempting to undermine the very survival that defined the crime, while experts testified about neurobiology, trauma recall, and the statistical rarity that makes such cases unforgettable. In the end, justice arrived, but imperfectly, because no sentence can restore lost time, erase scars, or fully silence the fear that lingers when someone has looked directly at their own death and returned. The public reaction was intense, equal parts relief, fascination, and anger, raising questions about how many cases have been closed too soon, how often victims are silenced by assumption rather than evidence, and how thin the line between solved and unsolved truly is. Today she lives quietly, name-withheld identity protected, carrying both survival and trauma as permanent companions. While her case stands as a warning within the world of true crime dark case files, and everywhere certainty arrives too early and truth is left behind. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about trust, about investigative bias, and about the terrifying possibility that some murders fail not because of justice, but because of chance, biology, and resilience beyond explanation. In the end, one question echoes through this dark case file: if she had not survived, would the truth have ever surfaced? Or would a lie have been buried as fact forever? This is Dark Case Files, where the shadows hold answers and silence is never the end of the story. And if this true crime story kept you questioning what you think, ask yourself, do you believe justice was truly served here, or is there still something missing beneath the surface? And before you leave, subscribe to Dark Case Files for more true crime stories, dark investigations, and narratives that refuse to stay quiet.